This is the third and final part of our lecture on research ethics. So we've been looking at the 4 different areas in which something about qualitative research that can raise particular ethical issues. So the 4th area, and perhaps the area where I think lots of the ethical issues about qualitative come up, is that qualitative research is personally intrusive. As this nice quote illustrates, the complexities of researching private lives and placing accounts in the public arena raise multiple ethical issues for the researcher. So in that question that we started with at the beginning of the lecture about what constitutes ethical practice in qualitative research, a lot of the things to think about are coming up here. Gaining insights into participants' perceptions of themselves and of others, of the meaning that participants attach to their thoughts and behaviours or the thoughts and behaviours of others. It raises all kinds of issues. Participants can sometimes see or confront their own thoughts or their own behaviours. And also we're in the ordinary everyday world of the participants. We're often doing our research in their workplaces or in their social places, and we're talking about things that matter, often talking about things that matter deeply to them. So there's particular kinds of things that can come up. And the first is an issue around confidentiality. So one of the interesting problems for us in qualitative research is about how we manage to make sure that people retain control of their information, when what they've done is they've handed that information over to us in an interview or a focus group, or by allowing us to observe them. So particular technical problems come up here. The first is, and when we interview somebody, it's often not just the researcher, interviewer, and the participant who gets to hear what's said. There's often, usually, even a transcriber who might isn't somebody known to the participant, and can often be somebody who's not known to the researcher. And sometimes there's also a translator. So they're also getting to hear all of the things that the participant said before you have done the work to make sure that there's no breach of that confidentiality. So things that we might do here is having a confidentiality agreement with our transcriber. If it's an external person, thinking and investigating where the data is being held. So when somebody transcribes, where do they hold the audio recording? Where do they hold the Word document that they transcribe into? And what agreement do you have for them to destroy that data once they have done their job? Secondly, of course, be aware of the relationships. So with transcribers, that's usually not an issue, but with translators, it can be. So thinking about who that translator is and whether they know the participant, and how you might manage issues around of confidentiality there. If we're doing observation, there's a whole literature actually in ethnography around this, but particular issues here around observing public spaces or virtual settings, which are effectively public spaces, where people might not know they're being observed, and yet they're behaving in a public space. So what kinds of expectations in terms of confidentiality might people have there, and how might you navigate that? As I said, there's a lot been written in ethnography around this, so there's clear disciplinary conventions, again, that can be explained to ethics committees. Focus groups produce a particular challenge around confidentiality, because I can make a promise about how I'm going to respect confidentiality and what the limits of that might be, but it's much more difficult for me to make that promise on behalf of the 7 or other 8 witnesses or participants who are in the room. So we have to be very clear in focus groups about how we manage confidentiality, about establishing group norms and rules up front, whilst at the same time acknowledging that we generally can't enforce them, but asking people to be thoughtful about being respectful of each other, but also to be thoughtful about what things they share. So the issue of potential harm that can come about if somebody is identified through the process of doing the research. And that identification is not unlikely. So if we think about in qualitative research, the participant is very, very rarely anonymous. So at the very least, it's likely that as an interviewer or a focus group person or the observer, that I have met or seen the participant who is providing the data. So I know who they are. I might only know their first name, but I might have a telephone number for them. So it's not anonymous. It starts not anonymous. So we have to think then about what kinds of identifying features we might have of a participant. So if somebody does an interview with us, we might, in a transcript, we might end up with a name, where they work, the name of their kids and their partner and the family members, their doctor, the hospital where they were treated, the particular illness that they had, or what particular kinds of events that have happened in their lives. We might have a story which makes somebody identifiable. So the very nature of that story might be either very well known, or it might be that among a small community of people who share that illness, that particular story is enough to have them identifiable, even if you don't say what their name is. If we're doing research using creative methods, so art-based research or ethnography, then the image of the person might make them identifiable. And of course, the other thing that can happen in an interview is that people share other people's stories that also might make them identifiable. So there's particular strategies that we can use here, and lots of these are procedural ethical issues, so we make it clear to an ethics committee that this is what we're going to do. Usually at a very basic level, all qualitative research will say we will not collect identifying information, or that we will anonymize it before analysis. So what that means is using pseudonyms, so taking out names and places and putting in a different name that's stands for that thing, or just taking it out and saying place 1, place 2, place 3. We can generalize demographic details. So is it important that we know that a participant has 2 children aged 4 and 10, or is it enough to know that they have children? Do we need to know that they're 22, or is it enough to say that they're in their 20s? Or do we need to say that they've been retired for at age 52 and that they've been retired for 7 years, or is enough to say that they're retired? So being really clear about what kind of information we provide about participants. Is it necessary, and are we making sure that we are protecting their identity? In highly sensitive contexts, so often in policy research, we might ask participants to approve quotes before we publish them, so that they can make a judgment about whether that will identify them and that they're comfortable with it. We can also create composite stories, so if we're worried that a story might identify a participant, if we were to publish it, then we can create stories from different participants. So all of these issues are about when we go to publish our research and we use quotes, or we tell stories about that the participants told us. And sometimes it's appropriate to negotiate identification with participants. So participants may feel like it's important for them to own their story, and so they might actually want their name associated with it. All of these things are absolutely in scope for the national statement, and it's about having a clear understanding with the participants about what you're going to do with the information, the private information that you give them, that they give you. The other area, of course, where qualitative research can be personally intrusive and that can create a problem is for participants revisiting upsetting experiences. So in the process of interviewing them or conducting a focus group, painful issues or old emotional wounds from the past can come up, either because you've asked people to talk about them, or sometimes unrelated, but it has raised an issue for somebody. The other thing that can come up is discomforting insights into their own behavior or other people's behavior. So suddenly they see something that they hadn't seen it in that way before. And you can imagine the kinds of things that can create problems for people, where suddenly a whole load of problems that they hadn't thought about as problems have become problems. And so now they have to deal with that, and that might be distressing, or it might mean that they have to take action that they hadn't thought about taking action about before. The other thing that can happen is that people can be telling an interviewer or facilitator, so a focus group, about something that maybe doesn't make them look very good, or that they feel shame about, and that can produce embarrassment or regret at having told more than you planned to tell. And so we have to think about the different ways that we can manage this. And I think the first thing to say is that I think we do have an obligation to anticipate the issues that might arise. So this is a procedural ethics issue. When the Ethics Committee asks us to think about potential harm to our participants, our job is to think really carefully about what's the topic about, who are the participants, what kinds of questions are we asking people. So what are we asking people to do in terms of telling us stories, or revisiting the past, or thinking about things in particular ways, and might that create upset or distress? In anticipating that, we can develop a plan and think about, do we want to change our questions? Do we want to think about how we might respond if somebody becomes upset or distressed about something? And these are all things that an ethics committee would expect of us. There are some limitations around this. So it can be very difficult. No, it is very difficult to anticipate all the things that might come up, because we don't really know who's going to walk through the door to do an interview with us. And I think the Guillemin and Gillam paper, so the anecdote that starts that paper about the woman in an interview who discloses something very distressing and illegal that's happening in her family, is a really good example of that. It was unrelated to the research topic, so the researchers couldn't have anticipated that specific issue would have come up. So thinking about having a plan and doing some training around how the people who are actually collecting the data might respond is important, both in terms of the specific, but also in terms of giving interviewers and focus group facilitators the skills to deal with the unexpected things that might come up. A related issue to be aware of here is that emotion is not bad. So the Ethics Committee isn't saying, will your questions or your research create emotion? It's about distress and harm. So we have to think about, when does upset become a problem for a participant and a problem for a research project? So are we asking reasonable questions? Have we thought about asking them respectfully? Do participants know the kinds of things that they're going to talk about? Do they have the opportunity to think about them, to say no, to skip questions? Have you been really clear with participants about that? What are you going to do if somebody gets emotional? So if somebody becomes upset or very distressed in an interview, or agitated or angry, how are you going to respond to that? And again, this is about anticipating, developing a plan in advance, and training. So the kinds of things that we usually say is to check in with a participant if they're starting to look agitated or upset, and negotiating the next steps. Do they want to take a break? Do they want to stop the interview completely? Maybe revisit at another time? Do they want to go out and have a cup of tea, walk around the block? Do they want to keep going? So being really clear with the participant that they're more important in this moment than you just collecting the data. And that's an ethical decision. The other thing we can do is to, as much as possible, prepare participants for the questions that we're going to ask. So that the participant information sheet we provide them before they do the research is really clear about the kinds of things that we're going to cover, that we don't ambush participants, that we are prepared to give participants the questions that we're going to cover, or the topics that we're going to cover in advance, if that helps, that they might want to prepare support. They might want to let someone know that they're doing the interview. If they have a therapeutic relationship, they might want to chat to their counselor or their psychologist about it before they do it. Another thing that we can do, that I often do, so this is a procedural ethics issue, is having referral options. So I already know the kinds of services I can refer participants to if they have, if they become upset about something. And I have a clear sense of the kinds of things that might come up. So I make sure I have a sexual assault support line. I know I have a drug and alcohol support line. I know I have access to a suicide support line. So that all of those things are things that I'm not scrambling for at the end of an interview. And the final thing to think about here is about support for the researcher. And this, your research project might be very mundane, or your research project might be on a topic which there's going to be a lot of distress. I have some colleagues who did some research around a chronic health illness where all of the participants would die from that illness, and during the course of the research quite a lot of them did. And so the researcher in fact became a participant or a witness in that journey with them. And so that's an area where you can anticipate that might be quite a difficult journey for the researcher. And so what kind of support from supervisors or potentially paid external supervision for the researcher, and being clear about the different kinds of mechanisms that we have to support researchers in that. The final area where being personally intrusive can cause problems is in the discovery of dangerous or illegal behaviour. So this is about witnessing or hearing something that could put a participant's employment or safety or health at risk or have legal consequences. And the national statement is very clear in some ways on this, which is it says to explain to participants as clearly as possible the extent to which the researcher will keep confidential any information about illegal activity by participants or others, and the response the researcher will make to any legal obligation or order to disclose such information. Now that sounds very simple, but it's actually quite complicated. I think a lot of researchers don't understand really what that means. So what our legal obligations are and what kinds of orders might come. So our data can become subject to court order. So for example, if we were doing research with children and there's a family breakup, a parent might seek access to our data where the children have been interviewed about their experiences of family life, because the parent might think that we have some relevant information that could help a judge decide and resolve a custody dispute. We might have collected information which is about illegal activity in relation to drug use, and the police might pursue a court order for that information in order to prosecute someone who's a participant of ours, or that a participant may have talked about. Now, those are unlikely but possible, okay? And I can give you examples of those things having happened. More likely is that people will tell us about things in an interview that might have dangerous or illegal consequences. So we need to think about how to anticipate those things to make sure that we protect participants as much as possible. This is about anticipating the kinds of things that might come up. And this is about, it often can be very easy. If you're doing research where people are likely to talk about illegal activity, then you need to think about this much more clearly. If you're doing research where people might talk about illegal activity, then you also need to think about this clearly. A lot of research projects, it's unlikely that people are going to tell you about illegal activity or dangerous behavior, but it's good to think about what you might do. So this is about understanding the researcher's potential legal responsibilities, being aware of our different roles. So a lot of researchers have the same responsibilities as a citizen does, but some of us will have mandatory reporter responsibilities because we're clinicians or educators. And you may also work in an area that has very clear code of conduct around these issues. So the first, depending on the kind of research you're collecting, being really careful about what kind of identifying information you're collecting, and flagging the issue of illegal behavior and what obligations as a researcher you might have. You can put that into the participant information sheets. Telling participants not to talk about anything illegal or stopping them in the moment when they start describing something. If a participant discloses something which is illegal or dangerous, or you have concerns about somebody's safety, stopping the interview to engage with them around what they've told you, what their motivation was, what do they want you to do, and what obligations you might have. So what do you have to do next? Again, it might be appropriate in some of those situations, especially if you're talking to someone who's a victim of dangerous or illegal behavior, to check in with them and think again about referral options. Depending on the research that you're doing, it might be appropriate to seek legal guidance before you go for ethical review. So to be really clear for an ethics committee that you've sought legal counsel from the university to get a really clear understanding of what kinds of legal obligations you might have. But that's in particular kinds of projects. But there's lots of things that can come up here. So having discussed all of those things and kind of shifted around a little bit from procedural ethics and what things you can anticipate, and talking about some issues about in the moment and how you might respond, we have a learning activity, and we've given you 2 case studies, one from a published article and one from quite a famous research study case that was in the media several years ago. And so there's 2. I would like you to look at both of them, but have a look and think about what are the ethically important moments in the account you're reading. What's gone wrong? So do you think something has gone wrong? Can you articulate what it is? What could have been anticipated? So this is the procedural ethics question. What strategies could have been employed to deal with this situation? And what should they do now? And this is different for the 2 cases. One of the cases is it's clear, it's an ethically important moment. So in the moment of doing an interview, what should the interviewer, at different points, what should they have done? Whereas in the other case study, it's a much bigger problem that's unfolded, but there's still a question about what should happen next. And also thinking kind of, putting yourself in the situation of different players in that case and thinking about what's gone wrong and what could have happened and what would you do. So after you've done that learning activity, I think just to kind of wrap things up by saying that I think it's really important that we think ethically from the very beginning of our projects, but that we continue to think about ethics throughout. I think the Guillemin and Gillam paper is a really nice example of the kind of ethical issues that can come up in a moment that could not have been anticipated, and that you have to make a decision that could have all kinds of implications. I really think it's important that we encourage open and continuing dialogue and reflection and learning between researchers and ethics committees. Researchers develop strategies for acting ethically, and we often do that not with an ethics committee. So we talk to colleagues, we read case studies, or we have a specific situation arises and we have to make a decision about what to do. And I think it's good that we try to have conversations with ethics committees about how those things happen. Training in ethics is available, and hopefully the conversations that we're having here in this lecture will be useful to people who are going on to do qualitative research, that you will be doing it ethically, I'm sure. There's some resources for you to follow up.